Okay, so the media continue to go completely nuts over the Trump administration policy, they say it's a policy, of separating children at the border. So let's go through the policy once more. Here is the policy. If you arrive at the border, not at the patrol stations, right? If you arrive at ports of entry and you claim asylum, we will not separate you from your children. If you arrive between ports of entry and we arrest you by operation of law, thanks to a Ninth Circuit Court ruling in 2016, thanks to that ruling, if we arrest you, we have to take your kids away from you because we can't hold your kids in jail with you. Now, there's a question as to how long we can hold the kids in jail with you. Do we have to immediately remove them? Or is it just that we have to remove them within 20 days? But bottom line is you will be separated from your kids if you are arrested. The Trump administration has changed policy in the sense that they are now treating everyone who crosses the border illegally as a criminal. But that was always the law. So they're basically just enforcing the law strictly. Now, I am a fan of enforcing the law strictly. The reason is not because I always think the law is a great idea. It's because I don't like the idea of executive discretion. I think executive discretion is a way of making bad laws palatable and making good laws unpalatable. If you actually want a law enforced the way that it is on the books, we're going to learn pretty fast whether that law is worthwhile or whether that law is not. The Obama administration sort of picked and chose how exactly they wanted to enforce immigration law. And it's important to note that these sorts of controversies over separation of families at the border, this sort of stuff was going on in 2014, 2015, when there was that vast influx of illegal immigrants swamping the southern border. Right, this is from the New York Times, July 25th, 2015. So a guy named Barack Obama was president then. A federal judge in California has ruled that the Obama administration's detention of children and their mothers who are crossing the border illegally is a serious violation of a long-standing court settlement, and that the families should be released as quickly as possible. So the Obama administration was arresting mothers, and they were keeping them with their children, and the court found that that was a problem. In a decision late Friday, roundly rejecting the administration's arguments for holding the families, Judge Dolly M.G. of the Federal District Court for the Central District of California found that 2 detention centers in Texas that the administration opened last fall failed to meet minimum legal requirements of the 1997 settlement for facilities housing children. Judge G also found that migrant children had been held in widespread deplorable conditions in border patrol stations. Okay, this is 2015. Under Barack Obama, migrant children had been held in widespread deplorable conditions in border patrol stations. After they were first caught, she said the authorities had wholly failed to provide the safe and sanitary conditions required for children, even in temporary cells. Right, so the kids were in cells, right? We're hearing the same sort of stuff now, but let's not pretend this is unique, because it's not. The opinion was a significant legal blow to detention policies ordered by Homeland Security Secretary Jay Johnson, remember this is 2015, in response to an influx of children and parents, mostly from Central America, across the border in South Texas last summer. In her 25-page ruling, Judge G gave a withering critique of the administration's positions, declaring them unpersuasive and dubious, and saying officials had ignored unambiguous terms of the settlement. The Department of Homeland Security was nailed for apparently trying to use this sort of policy as deterrence. So remember, the Trump administration has been ripped up and down for suggesting that separating families was a deterrent. They're not the first people to do this. Right? This is from the New York Times, 2015. Initially, Homeland Security officials said they were detaining the families to send a message to others in Central America to deter them from coming to the United States illegally. In February, a federal court in Washington, D.C. ruled that strategy unconstitutional. Officials stopped invoking deterrence as a factor in deciding whether to release mothers and children as they seek asylum in the United States. But many women and children remained stalled behind bleak walls and fences month after month with no end in sight. Mothers became severely depressed or anxious, and their distress echoed in their children, who became worried and sickly. Okay, so remember, again, this is 2015. So these issues have been plaguing the federal government since 2015. And in fact, this particular case that I'm talking about here was elevated to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals held that when a mother was held in detention, her child had to be released. The child could not be held in detention with the mom. They had to be released to a relative or to foster care or to somebody inside the HHS. And they pointed out that the federal government was using this sort of policy, holding mothers and children together, as a deterrent. So the same people who are now saying that Trump is separating families as a deterrent, 3 years ago, they were saying that holding mothers and children together was being used as a deterrent. Now, this is a direct quote from the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals case from 2016. Quote, in January 2015, a group of Central American migrants who are not represented by Flores Class Counsel filed a putative class action claiming that the government had adopted a no-release policy as to Central American families and challenging that alleged policy under the Due Process Clause. On February 20th, 2015, the U.S. District for the District of Columbia granted the plaintiff's motion for a preliminary injunction. The court found that ICE had not adopted a blanket no-release policy, but found ample support for the plaintiff's alternative contention that DHS policy directs ICE officers to consider deterrence of mass migration as a factor in their custody determinations, and that this policy has played a significant role in the recent increased detention of Central American mothers and children. In other words, all the talk about Trump being pro-deterrence, and that's so evil, it's so terrible, the hysteria that you're seeing, people comparing it to Japanese internment, people comparing it to the Nazis. Okay, this is something that the Obama administration was openly saying in 2015 and 2014. Openly. As litigated in court. And yet all we're hearing about is the Trump administration, their language about deterrence. We're hearing a lot about what John Kelly had to say about using separation of children from parents as a deterrent. Listen, I think that's wrong. I don't think we should be using separation of children from parents as a deterrent. All I'm pointing out here is there's a massive media double standard. When it was Obama, then they covered it. But let's just say that it wasn't this level of hysteria. That's pretty obvious. Here's John Kelly back in March talking about separating mothers from children.
We have tremendous experience in dealing with unaccompanied minors. We turn them over to HHS, and they do a very, very good job of either putting them in kind of foster care or linking them up with parents or family members in the United States. Yes, I am considering, in order to deter more movement along this terribly dangerous network, I am considering exactly that. They will be well cared for as we deal with their parents.
Okay, so we should not be using separation of parents from children as a deterrent because that's just cruel. Saying that you're going to use law enforcement as a deterrent, you're going to arrest everybody who crosses the border, that seems to me perfectly appropriate. Well, the Trump administration has decided that this is a political winner. What we have right now is a prisoner's dilemma. Okay, prisoner's dilemma is something in game theory where basically everybody's first choice ends up creating the worst possible outcome. So basically, here's the way this works. The Republicans have two choices. They can either attempt to alleviate this situation by passing a law, or they cannot attempt to alleviate the situation by passing a law. And Democrats similarly have two choices. They can either attempt to alleviate the situation by passing a law, or they cannot attempt to alleviate the situation by passing a law. If the Republicans attempt to alleviate the situation and Democrats refuse to go along with it, Republicans get the worst of both worlds. They look like pansies to their own base, and they get ripped by the press anyway, because the press is going to rip them no matter what. If Democrats go along with all of this, then they look like a bunch of people who are caving to Republicans for their own base, and they're not going to be credited by the media with the win. Trump will be credited with the win. So you end up with is a prisoner's dilemma in which both parties have an incentive not to make the right decision here, which would be to pass a simple piece of legislation saying that kids can stay with their parents in custody pending removal from the country. Right? That would be the easy way to solve all of this. But that looks like that is not going to happen. Trump administration is doubling down on all of this. President Trump himself came out yesterday. He said, listen, our goal here is we're not going to be a migrant camp. That's not something we're going to do.
The United States will not be a migrant camp, and it will not be a refugee holding facility. Won't be. You look at what's happening in Europe, you look at what's happening in other places. We can't allow that to happen to the United States. Not on my watch.
Okay, so, this obviously is part of Trump's chief appeal, is that he thinks that there's been a border that's swamped by illegal immigrants. The truth is that 2/3 of the people who are overstaying their visa, 2/3 of illegal immigrants are people overstaying their visas. But when President Trump says it's not the job of the U.S. to be a migrant camp, obviously this definitely appeals to the people who voted for him in the first place. One of the problems that the administration is having is they're sending a bunch of mixed messages. So, as I say, I think the media have been wildly dishonest on this entire issue. And I'm going to get to the media's dishonesty on all this. The media, by the way, exacerbate that prisoner's dilemma that I'm talking about. The media, by hyping up the hysteria, what they really do is they push the Trump administration into a corner where they're defending themselves from the assault, and they push Democrats to never make a deal with Republicans because they're winning politically. Democrats had control of the government, full control of the government from 2009 to 2011. They did not pass a single piece of serious immigration legislation. That's because they like the illegal immigration issue. They think that it's a political winner. They believe that if the press clubs Republicans with it, then they will win. Republicans have been the only ones who have come forward with any sort of immigration plan over the past 15 years. They've done it a couple of times. It's failed both times. One time because Republican base didn't want to do it. The other time also because the Republican base was not particularly interested. But the media's hysteria on this particular issue is making things worse, not better. So, with that said, the Trump administration press on this has really been bad. I mean, the press angle on this has been bad because you've had mixed messages. On the one hand, you've had certain officials like John Kelly saying, yes, we are separating parents from children at the border because we wish to deter people. Right, so that's the hardest possible position. And then you have President Trump saying, we are not going to be a refugee or migrant camp. That's not something we're going to do. And then you have Christian Nielsen, who is the head of the Department of Homeland Security, and she's basically saying, listen, it's not our policy to separate parents from kids. It's just a natural after effect of enforcing the law. Now, I think the Secretary of Homeland Security is correct, but she's the one who's been taking all the flack, which is kind of amazing. We'll talk about what she had to say yesterday. She did a full presser yesterday with a rabid media, and we'll go through it. So, Christian Nielsen is the head of the Department of Homeland Security, and instead of Sarah Huckabee Sanders doing the press conference yesterday with the press gaggle, instead she was called in sort of an emergency crisis management to deal with the press. Here's what she had to say about entering the country illegally.
This administration has a simple message. If you cross the border illegally, we will prosecute you. If you make a false immigration claim, we will prosecute you. If you smuggle illegal aliens across an extraordinarily dangerous journey, we will prosecute you.
Okay, so this makes perfect sense, right? If this were the administration's policy, this should have been the lockstep policy that they were talking about. None of this, I'm going to quote the Bible, none of this, we're trying to deter people. Bottom line is, you come across the border illegally, we're arresting you. And then the law operates as the law operates, right? It's not our job to make the law not operate that way. And as many people have pointed out, if you are arrested in the United States, if you and your wife are arrested in the United States for some sort of misdemeanor and you're put in jail overnight, we wouldn't take your kids with you. Right? That's the way the operation works. Okay, so Christian Nielsen was asked by the press about children. Are they being taken care of? Now, there have been a lot of conflicting reports over whether these kids are being taken care of properly or whether they are not. As I pointed out, in 2015, federal courts were finding as far back as 2014, 2015, that kids were being held in not great conditions, right? These kids were being held in conditions that lacked. We're hearing sort of conflicting reports. The department has not put out any pictures. They probably should put out pictures. The press have put out some pictures. They've not looked good. Christian Nielsen says the kids overall are being taken care of, however.
It is important to note that these minors are very well taken care of. Don't believe the press. They are very well taken care of. You know this, as many of you have detention facilities of your own. We operate according to some of the highest standards in the country. We provide food, medical, education, and all needs that the child requests.
Okay, here's a report from Kate Morrissey over at the San Diego Union Tribune. She writes, many elements of Casa San Diego, an El Cajon facility for unaccompanied children who arrived at the southern border, seem like what one would expect from a boarding school. There are classrooms, a play area with soccer goals, and a medical clinic with superheroes like Wonder Woman, Superman, and the Hulk on the walls. On closer inspection, details about the California licensed childcare facility run by Southwest Key Programs reflect the situation of the children it serves. It's surrounded by fencing that is backed by privacy netting, and a sign at the gate warns visitors it's under video surveillance 24 hours per day. If someone opens the front door of the facility without first swiping a badge, an alarm blares through the hallway, warning of potential escape. On Friday morning, a class of 15 boys recited all of the ways they had learned to greet each other. The most were Spanish speakers. They quickly moved through English, French, Italian, Portuguese, Mom, Arabic, and many more before erupting into applause. So this doesn't sound quite like the torture that's being portrayed in the press. Now, that's not to say there aren't some horror stories. And in a second, I'm going to play for you some of the audio from one of these supposed horror stories. And I'm going to talk about whether this is representative of the entire thing or whether this is just the press choosing one example out of many. But it is pretty obvious the White House is angry about the way this is being pitched. So the White House has said that they've had enough of this information. This is clip 17. Christian Nielsen, she says, listen, all of the talk about how we are basically seizing children from parents and then torturing them for pleasure, all that's not true.
There's a lot of misinformation about what DHS is and is not doing as it relates to families at the border. And I want to correct the record. Here are the facts. First, this administration did not create a policy of separating families at the border. We have a statutory responsibility that we take seriously to protect alien children from human smuggling, trafficking, and other criminal actions while enforcing our immigration laws.
And what she has to say there is basically true. And this is the line the administration should have taken. We're enforcing the laws. You don't like the laws, change the laws. Right? That should have been the line. Unfortunately, the Trump administration has too many cooks spoiling the broth. They have too many communications experts who are out there messaging. One of those communications supposed experts is Attorney General Jeff Sessions. He was on with Laura Ingraham last night, and he said, listen, this policy is designed as a deterrent.
Fundamentally, we're enforcing the law. If you break into the country in an unlawful...
But is it a deterrent, sir?
Well,
are you considering this a deterrent?
I see that the fact that no one was being prosecuted for this as a factor in a 5-fold increase in 4 years in this kind of illegal immigration. So, yes, hopefully people will get the message and come through the border at the port of entry and not break across the border unlawfully.
Okay, so that's a different take on deterrence than you were getting from General John Kelly. Right here, he's saying we're going to enforce the border because that's the deterrent. That's different from saying we're enforcing the separation policy as a deterrent. And then he said, listen, we want to allow asylum for people who qualify for it. It's not that the administration is denying people asylum. They're saying if you come through a port of entry, right, you come not illegally across the border, then we will treat you as anyone else who is seeking asylum. There's just so much press on this that is not true.
This is a serious matter. We need to think it through, be rational and thoughtful about it. We want to allow asylum for people who qualify for it, but people who want economic migration for their personal financial benefit and what they think is their family's benefit is not not a basis for a claim of asylum.
Okay, and obviously that is true as well. So how are these kids being kept? So I talked a little bit before about one of the accounts that these kids are basically being kept in humane conditions. Well, this is audio yesterday that was released about agents from ICE mocking crying children, or agents from HHS mocking crying children. And you can hear the kids crying in the background. Here's what that sounds like. And this has, of course, made the rounds in a major way. It says, well, we have an orchestra here, right? What we're missing is a conductor. So this has been going around because you can hear the hubbub in the back, and you can hear some of the crying children, and then you can hear a man yelling, "Don't cry." Right? So it's just, that sort of stuff is not great. Now, Michelle Malkin points out that the mother of the 6-year-old girl in this audio paid a smuggler $7,000 to guide them through Guatemala, Mexico, and across the border into the United States illegally. Who bears the blame for putting the child at risk of kidnapping, death, and separation? Well, there's certainly some truth to that. That said, could there be a more humane policy? Sure, there could. And it turns out that Congress is pursuing that more humane policy. Speaker Ryan's office is pursuing this policy that would clear all of this up in not one, but two separate immigration bills. Ted Cruz has now proposed an immigration bill that is specific to this particular issue, right? Mark Meadows has joined him. So here's Mark Meadows, a member of the House Freedom Caucus. Right? This guy's about as conservative as he comes. As Representative Mark Meadows, he says they're going to introduce legislation later today that will allow parents to stay with their kids as they await detention.
We're going to introduce later today a piece of legislation that actually is more narrow than the two pieces that the president will be talking about with members of Congress this afternoon. What it does, it deals with this issue that we're having at the border with the separation of children from their parents. It also deals with some of the asylum issues at the border.
Now, one of the things that is important to note about this is if, in fact, the Republicans put up a separate bill that says, listen, we're going to solve this particular issue. Kids get to stay with parents until deportation or until asylum arrangements are made. If that were the policy, do you think Democrats would vote for it? I don't. I don't think Democrats would vote for it. I think Democrats would vote against it, specifically because they think they've got a political winner on their hands. I think that they believe they have a political winner because there's a poll out today showing that 2/3 of Americans don't like the separation policy, while a majority of Republicans do. That's a political winner for Democrats. They want to hold Trump's feet to the fire on all of this. And you can hear the press corps jumping with both feet on all this. So in just a second, I want to talk about the press and how the press have lied routinely about all of this. I mean, it is just insane. They continue to drive up the insane levels of rhetoric regarding this entire issue. Okay, so the press, when it comes to all of this stuff, have been deeply irresponsible, of course. And this is egging Democrats toward not making a deal, toward not making things better. How irresponsible have the press been on all of this? Here's a member of the press corps aghast over that audio that we played of crying children in a border facility. Press corps, they were talking about how terrible all this was. They were tweeting out Jorge Rivas. He tweeted, he's from ProPublica, I believe, and he tweeted out, reporters are listening to audio of kids crying in Border Patrol facility moments ahead of press briefing. Philip Bump, I believe he's of the Washington Post, said this is extremely hard to listen to. Elise Jordan, who I believe is a MSNBC and NBC News contributor, says this is tragedy porn for sadists. Right? Chris Chaliza of CNN said this cannot happen in America. Igor Bobek, he's also a reporter. He says that this is just sickening. He's a reporter at Huffington Post. Okay, well, whether or not you like the policy, whether you think that audio is stomach churning, and I think that it is stomach churning, the real question is, how do you solve that? And I think the press, I think many members of the press, they think, oh, well, you know what? We'll jar the American public into action here. We will force them into action by creating this groundswell of anger about the separation of parents from children. What they're really doing is they're driving the Trump administration into a bunker, and they're driving Democrats never to make a deal. Because believe you me, Democrats in Congress do not care about getting a deal done on this particular topic. Or we'll find out if they do. Because Republicans should put up a standalone bill to solve this issue and see if Democrats will vote for it. I highly doubt they will. Because why would they? Politically speaking, better to keep the illegal immigration issue burning. Better to ensure that illegal immigration issue keeps getting people to the polls than to actually solve the issue. This is one of the big problems with modern American politics. We don't elect our politicians to actually get things done. We elect our politicians as a sort of emotional catharsis. And Democrats are looking at issues like this and thinking, boy, this is a political winner for 2018. Wait till we get to the midterms. So that's why when reporters are going over the top about all of this, what they're really doing is making it less likely that a deal is going to get done. What they really should do is they should just report the facts without any of the over-the-top emotional passion and just report it. The American people can make up their own minds. But here, for example, is a reporter to Christian Nielsen, the head of DHS, pummeling her, suggesting that this is a sort of child abuse. This is, and it was like this all day yesterday, basically.
Are there any examples of child abuse, you believe? And how could this not be child abuse for the people who were taken from their parents? Not the ones who were sent here with their parents' blessing with the smugglers, and the people who were taken from their parents.
Unfortunately, I'm not in any position to deal with, hearsay stories. If someone has a specific allegation, as I always do when I testify, I ask that they provide that information to the Department of Homeland Security. We will look into it. Of course, we do not want any situation where a child is not completely adequately taken care of.
Okay, so I think the policy itself should change. And again, this is why I think that Ted Cruz's bill that he's bringing up is useful. I think that these kids should stay with their parents. I'm not in favor of kids being separated from their parents under any circumstances. I will point out the mild irony of so many Democrats who believe in no-fault divorce and think that if a parent wants to remove himself from the kid, that's totally fine. But if the government removes the kid from the parent, that, of course, is totally different. I guess the kid doesn't matter in all of that, right? It's just the parent's consent to any of that. If you get divorced without the kid wanting you to, then that's totally fine. But bottom line is, people of good heart can agree that this stuff should not be happening. The question is, how is this actually going to get solved? Democrats are having too much fun ripping into the Trump administration to actually solve the problem, however. So Nancy Pelosi is having a lot of fun calling Donald Trump barbaric. This is their favorite thing.
All here for arranging for this visit for the Congressional Hispanic Caucus and other members of our caucus on this heartbreaking, barbaric issue that could be changed in a moment by the presidency of the United States rescinding his action.
It's barbaric. It's barbaric. Okay, fine. So then why don't you work with the Republicans to solve it? Hey, Hillary Clinton, she comes back from the dead to call President Trump a liar and unchristian for enforcing the same policy that she was touting a few years ago. Right? She was in the administration when a lot of this policy was being touted. She was there. Right? She only left in 2013? So these policies were already being undertaken by the Obama administration. And by the way, when she was running for president, she said that we can't keep the kids here. We should be deporting the kids as well. But here she is ripping into President Trump and saying he's a liar and unchristian.
Separating families is not mandated by law at all. That is an outright lie. And it's incumbent on all of us, journalists and citizens alike, to call it just that. Those who selectively use the Bible to justify this cruelty are ignoring a central tenet of Christianity.
Okay, the law does say that if you arrest the parents, you have to release the kids. That is, in fact, the law. What Democrats want is for the parents to be released as well. How do we know that? Because it turns out that in that Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals ruling that I've been talking about for the last several days, the one that suggested they have to release the kids, the plaintiffs in that case were saying that you should also have to release the parents. They were saying you should have to release the parents as well, because otherwise you are violating the rights of the children. So that's their actual goal here. The Democrats don't want a solution because they're hoping to leverage President Trump into backing down and just releasing people into the interior of the United States, into the general population. Right? This is the actual goal in all of this. And again, you can tell this because Republicans are perfectly willing to come to the table with some solutions. Mark Meadows is one of the most conservative members of the House. Ted Cruz is one of the most conservative members of the Senate. Here's what Ted Cruz said yesterday. So Ted Cruz put out a statement on all this. He said, all Americans are rightly horrified by the images we are seeing on the news. Children in tears pulled away from their mothers and fathers. This must stop. Now, we can end this crisis by passing the legislation I'm introducing this week. Repeatedly, I have visited detention facilities tragically housing young children. For far too long, children have been the greatest victims of our broken immigration system, with tens of thousands of children who were detained under the Obama administration and continuing through today, and with far too many of those children facing horrific physical or sexual assault from criminal human traffickers. So Ted Cruz is on the same page as the Democrats here, right? Because everybody's on the same page. Nobody really likes this policy very much. Okay, so Congress should solve it. I do love the idea that in American government, whenever there's a problem, it's the executive branch's problem to solve it. You don't like the policy? Well, I guess the executive branch just won't pay attention to the law. I guess the executive branch will just stop enforcing the law. This, of course, is what Obama did on immigration. Right? Obama's executive amnesty was Obama refusing to enforce the law with regard to the so-called Dreamers. My view was we ought to change the law, enforce the law, unless you want to change the law. It is the executive branch, not the legislative branch. The legislative branch legislates. The executive branch executes. The executive branch does not get to make up its own body of law simply because it wants to. But because we think the president is some sort of king who sits on top of a throne determining what laws to enforce and what laws not to enforce, the Trump administration gets all the blame. Congress could solve this today. They won't. They're having too much fun demagoguing the issue.